Welcome to Partnerships for Profit, the podcast where we bring you inside the world of joint ventures, strategic partnerships, and powerful collaborations. Each episode, you'll dive into conversations with top entrepreneurs, visionaries, and business leaders, unlocking the secrets to building profitable relationships that drive growth and success. Whether you're looking to expand your network, find new referral partners, or scale your business, you're in the right place. Let's get started.
Welcome to Partnerships for Profit, presented by LeDuc Entertainment. Today we are joined by Jessica Fialkovich, the founder of Exit Factor. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Adrian. It's great to be here.
Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Exit Factor?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm originally from New Jersey. I live in Texas now. So still Jersey girl inside, but now I know how to wear cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. But I started my first business when I was 24 years old. So I was part of that millennial crowd that during the Great Recession, we ran out of jobs basically for millennials to have. And so coming out of that, I really found this ambition to start my own business and be an entrepreneur because I had been raised with this mentality that having a job with a big corporate company was the safe path in life, right? And I think a lot of us realized during that Great Recession that some of those big safe companies were actually the opposite of safe. So I decided that I was going to control my destiny by starting my own company. I started in the luxury wine space. So think like bottles of wine between $500 and like $25,000 of a bottle, which is really interesting for me because my husband jokes with me all the time. Before that company, like the highest end wine I drank was like Relax Riesling, which was like $9.99 at Total Wine. And so we kind of fell into this luxury wine space of working with collectors worldwide and trading wine at auction markets in like Hong Kong, which I had no idea that that was a thing. But started that company, like I said, when I was 24, built the company with every intention of selling it. This was going to be a flip for me. I call it my early life crisis. But I never did anything to plan for that exit. And then when I just sold the company about 4 years later, so really quick turnaround, we were very fortunate to have a good financial exit. But I made a lot of key mistakes in that process that had I educated myself ahead of time, probably wouldn't have made those mistakes. So right. I left a lot of money on the table. I sold to the wrong person, honestly, because she was the only buyer for the business, right? And because of that, a few years later, the company no longer existed and all my employees lost their jobs. So that really inspired me to get into exit planning and mergers and acquisitions, which was my next entrepreneurial experience. And I've been in that space now for about 12, it'll be coming up on 13 years now. Wow. And have worked with over 1,500 business owners, either in planning or overseeing their final exit and M&A transaction. So that's kind of my full story and where I came from.
And can we dive a little deeper? What are some of the pain points and problems that people are experiencing when they come to Exit Factor for help?
Yeah. So at Exit Factor, what we specialize in doing is we help people prepare for a future exit. So that could mean selling the company. It could be passing it on to the next generation. It could even be hiring a CEO. But the key is the owner stepping out of that CEO role. Right. And so a lot of the pain points, I look at it, we have a 5-phase process. The first is really the pain point is like knowing what they actually want. So goal setting is something that we do in our businesses a lot of times as entrepreneurs, but taking a step back and thinking about like, what is our overall personal goal in alignment with this business is sometimes a very challenging question for an owner to answer. So that's a common pain point that we address first. The second is around valuation expectations and aligning with the marketplace. There's a lot of, I wouldn't call it pain, but just general lack of understanding or confusion about how the business for sale marketplace works. If you're going to pass it on to the next generation, how does funding work? Things like that. Right. So that's a big pain point too. And then also designing a company that's very attractive to those groups, either whether it's a buyer or financier. So we look at, profit margins is a big thing. How much of the business is dependent on the owner, which are usually two big unknown pain points, I'd say, for owners, right? They can't self-identify that coming in, but as we start talking, they're like, wow, I mean, this business really is dependent on what's up here in my mind and not necessarily like a system, right? Or a model. So,
right.
Yeah.
Now, it sounds like you have to create a pretty custom tailored approach for each business. Is that correct? Like, is it a one size fits all approach for what your strategies are, or do you have to kind of custom tailor them to, each individual client?
Yeah, it's funny. The longer I've been in business, the more the Pareto principle, like I feel like applies to everything, which is, 80% of the time, the 20%, it works, right? The 80-20 rule. And so 80% of what we need to do in exit factor and for exit planning is going to be largely the same for all businesses.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter if you're a very small business or a very large business. It doesn't matter if you're a manufacturing company or you're a tech company, right? Because when it comes to exit and exit strategy, you need to like think about a business as like just another financial asset or a vehicle, right? So the inner workings of the industry in that specific business for 80% of the things you need to do is the same.
Right.
Now, what we do in exit factor is there is a customization piece for that other 20%, right? So there may need to be tweaks to the plan. Obviously, if you're selling a company for $1 million versus $100 million, there's some different tweaks you have to do and things like tax strategy and deal
Right.
structure that might not apply to both. So our model is to have a systematic model and plan that we can apply to most businesses and then make those 20% tweaks to customize it for the specific business case we're working on.
Well, and can you speak a little bit about maybe what does that discovery phase look like where you're trying to figure out what those, individualized needs maybe are?
Yeah. So we start every client engagement with what we call an exit assessment. So an exit assessment is basically like a business valuation combined with a strategic plan. It tells us, first of all, where the business is at today. What is the business value today? And what are the inner workings of the business that are going on from the operational side? But we also, the strategic planning piece is we plan out the goals for the future. So we help the owner establish what do they want to exit for? What is that ideal buyer or successor? And what's the timeline? And then it also comes up with what we call a roadmap. So that roadmap tells us from a quantitative perspective where their numbers need to be. What's the revenue need to be at? Where do their profit margins need to be? And ultimately, what does that mean for their multiple and for their valuation? And then also there's a qualitative component to it. So we came up with a 75 plus questionnaire of qualitative factors, think more processes, operations, people, plans that affect business valuation and the transferability to the business. And so that's a lot of questions. That's a lot of aspects. But what we do for each business is we focus on, okay, what are the 3 to 5 things we can do this year out of those 75 that are going to impact this business the most? So I'll give you an example. I was working with a client once, and one of the aspects of that we ask is something about client concentration. Client concentration is when you have one or a few customers that power most of your revenue in your business, right? So this client, they were in the medical device industry, and they won contract that was 80% of their revenue. And I think as entrepreneurs, and this is a lot of stuff like exit strategy, almost like flips business strategy on its head sometimes. Like, we hear as entrepreneurs, it's great to go after the big contract, work with customers that are more valuable, take less of your time. But then when you go on the exit strategy side, that's actually a big red flag and a risk, right?
Right. Interesting.
So this is a big red flag when you're going into an M&A transaction or anything like that. So for this client, 80% of the revenue, if that something happened to that client or this owner moved on and that client had a specific relationship with that owner, put the business at a huge risk, right? So we elevated that to one of the top 3 to 5 things we were working on, which is customer diversification in that first year of engagement. So we take the 75 and then we say, okay, what are the top 3 to 5 critical factors that need to change for this business this year? Work on those. And then we do the whole thing all over again at the start of every year. So,
Do you ever run into a situation where you're working with a business owner that just doesn't know what they want?
All the time.
And how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think, it's so funny. So I just, before this, I was at my entrepreneurial mastermind circle. I'm part of a group called EO. And the opening question was, what do you want your legacy to be? Right. And so here I am sitting and doing what I do. Right. And I still have a hard time answering that question. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs do have a hard time painting the future. There's a joke in the exit planning industry. We call it the rolling 5, which means that If you ask a business owner when they want to exit, they'll say 5 years from today. If I ask them that same question 1 year from today, they'll still say 5 years, right? It's just the rolling 5 years. And I think what ends up happening, and I gave a whole talk on this actually at an industry association conference last year, is that subconsciously we're nervous about the day after, right? So it's all fine and dandy to paint these exit plans and say, I want to exit for $10 million in 5 years. But what do you do the day after when your whole identity and your whole role in life has been wrapped up into running this business and you don't have a plan for the next day? So I think like subconsciously we start to put ourselves into that rolling 5 until we can answer the day after question. And that's what I find our clients struggle with a lot, right? They'll say, well, I'm going to retire. Great. What are you going to wake up and do on Monday morning when you're retired? Like, you're going to, play pool with yourself, or like, what are you going to do? Right. So that's what they struggle with. Like, it's the quantitative stuff. Yeah, sure. They can fire off those goals all they want. But until they can answer that day after question, they actually don't have the motivation to put those plans into motion, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, can you share with us what are some of the common mistakes that business owners are making when they're going about, creating these exit strategies and planning their exit out of a business?
Yeah. The number one key mistake is they wait too long. So we all think, I think as the older you get, you realize you don't have a lot of this, but we all think we have time, right? In life. And when you look at M&A transactions, 95% of those transactions are done for an immediate personal reason. So things like burnout, illness, unfortunately, death, relocation, divorce, like the D's, right? That's why 95% of business owners exit their companies. And if you think about those types of reasons, you can't pre-plan for that. Like even burnout in and of itself, if anyone's experienced burnout, it's like hitting this wall and not being able to get out of bed and do anything, right? And you don't really need to, you can't really see it coming. So, one of the things I say is the best time to start putting an exit plan in place is the first day you start your company. The next best day is today. Most of us probably already have a company running, but just because you have an exit plan in place does not mean you have to exit. It just gives you an out, right? You know what you're going to enact if something like that hits you. The other thing is too, what most business owners don't realize is that even if you are like, you're so focused on the financials and you want to achieve this goal, most valuations are not based on 1 year of success. They're based on a blend of 5 to 7 years of financial history. So if, say, you have a growth mindset of your business, right? And you see tech companies do this a lot, like reinvest all the profits, like spend to get the top line higher, right? And then I'll focus on profitability. Like when I'm getting to like my year before exit, I'll focus on profitability. It's actually backwards. Like you have to build the profitability in the model first, right? And then grow if you want to maximize your valuation. So that's the biggest mistake I see by far. And I think just the pre-planning in and of itself actually resolves all the other mistakes that we see. So,
well, in regards to that pre-planning, how far out should business owners be thinking about their exit? How far out should that pre-planning phase be done?
yeah. So if we're looking at a timeline, it's a minimum of 5 years. And here's how it works. So let's say in this scenario, most business owners end up selling their companies as their exit, right? So the sale process takes about a year, right? So if we're 5 years away, that brings us to 4 years, right? Then I just mentioned at a bare minimum, your valuation is going to be blended on 3 years of financial performance. So you want 3 really good years to come into that weighted average. So that takes us from 4 years to now we've got a year. And then at a bare minimum, you want a year to get the business fundamentals in place. Make sure those profit margins are in line, make sure your processes are in line. So you go into that 3-year period at the highest possible, right? So that gives you like a minimum of 5 years. Obviously, more time is better. Like that average could be, like I said, 3 to 7 years. It might take you 2 or 3 years to get the fundamentals right in the business, but 5 years is the bare minimum. So,
and you mentioned that sales process, that sales period, you said it's a year?
On average, yeah. So some companies can sell in 6 months. Some companies can take 2 or 3 years. Larger companies can take a longer time to sell. Niche companies can take a longer time to sell. Rural companies can take a longer time to sell, right? There's stages in that process. Like first, you have to, find your advisors and hire your deal team. Then you got to go out and find buyers, vet buyers. That can
Right.
take a really long time. And then there can be there is a due diligence and a lending process that can take anywhere from 2 months to 10 months, depending on who the buyer is and how the financing structure is going to come together. So yeah, on average, about a year. So.
And and can you explain a little bit about that process of what that looks like? I mean, and I don't know if this is a little bit out of, your realm at Exit Factor or not, but could you explain a little bit about what that finding a buyer process looks like?
Yeah. So typically, when you're looking for someone who's going to purchase your business, you're going to first want to engage a professional that does that, a business broker, an investment banker. The delineation usually there is about 25 million in value. So over
Wow.
25 million, you'd work with an investment banker, below probably a business broker, M&A advisor. But they help you evaluate which buyer groups that are going to be most attracted to your business. So there's really a few core buyer groups. The first that a lot of people think about is what's called a strategic or a synergistic buyer. So that could be a competitor or another business similar to you. So like if you think strategic's easy, that's a competitor, right? But if you're a synergistic buyer, maybe you own a roofing company and a general contractor buys you. That's a synergistic relationship, right? They're only about 10% of the business buying market, right? So a lot of people think to them first, but in terms of quantity of how many are in the business buying market, there's not a lot of them, right?
Interesting.
The second group a lot of entrepreneurs think about is private equity firms. Well, private equity firms typically are only buying businesses that produce $1 million in EBITDA or higher. And there's only about 4,500 legitimate private equity firms in the United States. So again, they represent probably 10% or less, depending on the size of the business, of the buyer group. And then the last group, if we're not talking about internal sales like family, friends, things like that, the last group is what we call individual buyers. So these are people that are coming from corporate and they're entering entrepreneurship through acquisition, or they've sold a business in the past and now they're returning to buying a business, but it's an individual, right? And they're 80% of the buyer market. The key is for them, there's thousands of them. Like I'm talking, like I'm a partner in a business brokerage firm, and on average, we get 100 buyers per listing per week inquiring on the businesses. So finding the buyers, like if you're working with the right advisory team, is actually not that difficult. Now, finding the right buyer that has the money and the motivation and is going to move forward with the deal, that's the key. So there has to be like a strong vetting process in order to make sure that you're not working with the wrong buyer. They're not wasting your time, or the worst case scenario, they're not doing something detrimental to your company. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that 80% number is much, much higher than I thought it would be. Why do you think that the individual buyers are dominating sort of that space?
They always have. Like it really has
Really?
always been that way. Now, I will say it's growing, right? So those data, like that data is like probably 5 or 6 years old. I would venture to say if we in the business brokerage side that I own, if we ran those numbers again, it'd probably be even more skewed. So since the pandemic, Gen X has been pretty entrepreneurial. The millennial generation has gotten very entrepreneurial. And it's interesting because they look at businesses, like I mentioned before, as assets or investments, right? So there's a lot of business buyer groups now that have inspired, instead of starting your own business, go after and buy a business already. And so this millennial generation, who was very unentrepreneurial before the pandemic, has suddenly flipped. And now there's thousands
Right.
upon thousands. I mean, like I mentioned our buyer inquiries, they 4x'd after the pandemic on a
Oh,
weekly
wow.
basis. It's settled down a little bit, but we're still about 2.5 to 3 times higher than we were in 2019. And that's the kind of like
Wow.
mindset shift that happened with that generation.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, are there any other trends that you were seeing in sort of the mergers and acquisitions space? And where do you think that space is going to go? Say, then you talked about the rolling five. Where do you think the space is going to go in 5 years?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. When I was growing up, like I loved history and sociology and demographic stuff. And it's fun when I get to use that in our business today. But I really think that's where the trends and differences are lying. So everyone's been focused on this baby boomer transition, wealth transition, business transition. Baby boomers at one point owned like 60% of all the businesses in America. Depending on the data today, they're about, 40 to 50%. The data we follow is about 42%, right?
Wow.
So they've been selling off their businesses. I mean, the youngest baby boomers are 61 right now. The oldest are 79. I was just listening to a report and they're like, yeah, so some of the older ones are thinking about wanting to retire. And I thought to myself, I'm like, oh my God, if I'm at 79 thinking about retiring, I've done something wrong, which makes me a total millennial, right? So so that transition, like we've been talking about, my mentor and I, Andy Cagnetta, we have a podcast as well called The Deal Board. We've been talking about the seller tsunami for probably 7 or 8 years. We're coming towards the end of it. Like in the next 5 years, most of the baby boomers have to exit their business, or they're going to have to, just for age and health reasons, right?
Right.
What's coming up behind them, though, is really interesting because we do have a mindset shift with Gen X and millennials that instead of holding a company for 30 or 40 years, one company, Gen X and millennials are going to flip companies. Just like we see in the job market, right? You hear complaints from business owners. People used to spend their entire careers with one company and now they have 3 companies or 3 jobs in 3 years, right? It's the same kind of thing with a business. Like you're not going to see somebody flipping a company every year, but the whole time is going to be about 10 years. So it's going to create a much more active market, meaning there's going to be a lot more opportunities coming on and off the market than what we've seen in the past. And for me, I think that's very exciting, right? It's really going to expand this small and mid-sized business marketplace almost to be more reflective as like, or more active than the stock market, right?
Right.
So I think that's the most interesting trend that we can be watching for over the next 5 to 10 years. There's other dynamics going on with interest rates and stuff like that we can talk about. I talk about them all day, but it's not as interesting as the demographic research for me. So
Of all the people that you have helped through Exit Factor, when you think back, is there maybe a story you could share with us of a business or a client that you really saw a transformation or a positive outcome in their exit that you helped guide them through? And could you maybe share a story like that with us?
yeah. So God, there's so many. And it's so funny. There's some of the large companies that we work with, there's phenomenal financial results. Like on average, our clients exit for 56% more than when they originally came to
Wow.
us. But I think the most impactful ones is sometimes the smaller clients, and also the things that they're able to get through it. So there was a business owner that we worked with, and he emigrated from the Ukraine years ago, right? This is like 20, 30 years ago, left his entire family there, and started a business here with the purpose of sending money back home, right? And so over the course of owning the business, he bought his aunts, uncles, cousins, like homes, things like that. And we worked with him to grow that business, eventually sell that business. And this is before the war started, right? But he was able to return home and basically financially provide for his entire extended family for the rest of their lives, right? And we're not talking about 10, $20 million that he exited for. Like we're talking about a couple $1,000,000. And I think when you look at those kinds of stories, that's very inspirational, right? There's other stories like, the medical device client we worked with, I mentioned, that's inspirational too. They exited very successfully. They increased the value of their company almost by 90% in 18 months. They retired. They spend time with their grandkids all the time now. They winter in Cabo. Like that's the kind of retirement I want to do. But I also like where you see the business owners building something and then turning around and giving it back to their family, their community.
Absolutely. That's incredible. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I do want to touch on something else amazing before our time is through here. You
Yeah.
are a #1 best-selling author.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Yeah. Just casually. No. You are a #1 best-selling author. That's amazing. Can you speak
Yes.
to us a little bit about that achievement and what the book is about? Or is
Yeah.
it
So
multiple books? I don't know.
yeah, there will be. Actually, I haven't talked about this yet, but so I
Oh,
wrote my first book, Getting the Most for Selling Your Business, and I released that in April of 2022. We hit a #1 status on Amazon in multiple categories as
wow.
top seller there. That one is really about if you're a year or less ahead of going to the market, like what can you do to position your business so you can maximize, right? So if you didn't have this 5-year plan before, it's really about the sales process and making sure you're navigating that sale process effectively. The new book that's coming out, which is called Exit Factor, named after our company, is going to be more about the pre-planning. So that's about that 5-year journey leading up, and that's coming this fall of 2025.
Wow. I mean, is that a scoop? Is that the first
That
time?
is a scoop. Yeah, it's the first time I've talked about it on a podcast. Yes.
That's fantastic. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and can you tell us a little bit now? You're a speaker as well, right? And you've done some speaking engagements. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, I primarily speak on the topic of, increasing your value or building a valuable business, typically either in a keynote format, or I do host workshops as well. So one thing, and I fall into this category too, I find that business owners, we can be a little bit more critical of other people's businesses, less critical of our own, right? So my favorite thing to do is to do the workshop, and we bring in a case study where we get to learn how to build a valuable business, but we also get to critique somebody else's business and show them the path of what they're leaving on the table, right?
Right.
And at the end of that, the reflection is, how can we apply these lessons to our own businesses? But I deliver that to entrepreneurial crowds, typically owners only. So we're not bringing any key executives or anything in like that. So we can have highly confidential conversations in that room.
And if there was, and say that there is a business owner listening, right, that is thinking about starting to put together their exit strategy for their business, what would be the number one piece of advice you could share to someone looking to put together an exit strategy for their business?
Yeah, I think the number one thing, just starting point, is just have an exit assessment done on your company, whether it's through my company Exit Factor or another, because you really just need to understand where your business is at today, where you're going, and what's going to prevent you from getting there, right? And whether you start working on that, 5 to 7 year plan or not, who cares? At least you have the knowledge, right? It's almost like I've got my annual physical coming up this Friday, right? It's kind of like we take care of your body, you figure out what's working, what's not, what needs a surgery. And it's the same thing with your business. If you just get that annual checkup done, then
Right.
Even if you lack on the pre-planning, which obviously I'm a big proponent of, at least you have the knowledge, right? And you're not going into a sale or a transition of ownership with, blinders on.
And what could a business owner expect out of that exit assessment? Just, going in blind, what can they expect?
So it'll tell them the current value of the company, right? It will help them predict or create a goal for the future. What do they want to exit for financially? And from that, it'll tell them this is where your revenue needs to be. This is where your profit margin needs to be. And then these qualitative things are not working in your business, right? So in ours, like I said, 75 points, right? So it'll give you the things that really need to adjust in that business and what's, driving that value either higher or lower, right? So key financial metrics that you would need to achieve your goal, and then also any type of operational or qualitative procedures that need to be adjusted as well.
Well, Jessica, this has been an absolutely awesome, super informative conversation. If anybody out there listening could use your help, could use the help of Exit Factor, where can the people find you?
Yeah. So exitfactor.com will point you to our company. We're actually a franchise company. So I'm the founder and president of the franchisor. We have 31 active offices across the US and over 50 certified consultants. You can also find me. I'm pretty active on social media at Jessica Fialkovich, both on Instagram and LinkedIn.
Jessica, thank you so much again for coming on the show. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a great time.
Thanks again, and thank you everyone for listening. This has been Partnerships for Profit, presented by LeDuc Entertainment. Jessica, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Partnerships for Profit. We hope you've gained valuable insights on how to form profitable partnerships and take your business to the next level. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Got a partnership story to share or someone you'd like to see featured on the show? Reach out to us. Until next time, keep building those partnerships for profit.